Hello and welcome to Bourbon Rocks. This is another one of our introductory videos where we're not going to do any actual tasting of bourbon. We're just going to explain what bourbon is and so forth. Our first introductory video explained us, the site, me, and what we do. This one's actually going to talk about bourbon. What is bourbon? Bourbon is a whiskey, which means that it's made from grain and aged in oak. All bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. Bourbon is the only uniquely American spirit, which means it has to be made in the United States. Okay. Now, it does not necessarily have to be made in Kentucky. About 95% of bourbon is made in Kentucky, but it can be made in any state. It actually can even be made in United States territories. You could make a bourbon in Puerto Rico. I don't know if anyone has or if it would be any good, but you could. You could make bourbon in Puerto Rico because it is part of the United States. You can finish bourbons, and we'll have a whole talk about like finishing and so forth as well. But finishing is once you've made a bourbon, you have to make a bourbon by the bourbon rules, and then you can finish it other ways, lots of different ways. There's a few rules regarding those, but you can do a lot of stuff to bourbon once it's a bourbon. But it has to be made a bourbon in the United States. I know of an English bourbon, Never Say Die, that is actually a Kentucky bourbon. It's distilled and aged in Kentucky and then taken to England and finished. So it's technically an English product, but it was a Kentucky bourbon before they finished it, so it still gets to be a bourbon. There are Jefferson, for example, has a lot of expressions. The ocean, which they take a Kentucky bourbon and they put it on a ship and they sail it around the world across the equator to essentially finish it, okay? Because it is an aged Kentucky bourbon before they put it on the ship. So still a bourbon, even though they've done finishing elsewhere. There's the Tropics, which is the New Jefferson line where they take the Kentucky bourbon to the tropical area. That first expression was done in Singapore. But again, it's a finishing. It's already a Kentucky bourbon before they finish it, and so it can still be a bourbon. I was in Switzerland and I got this bottle of Swiss bourbon, which technically could not be sold in the United States as a bourbon. They could sell it as a Swiss whiskey, but you couldn't sell it in the United States as a bourbon because it's not made in the United States. You also couldn't sell it in Europe because the EU and Britain, the United Kingdom, abide by the United States guidelines for bourbon. But because Switzerland's not part of the EU, they could sell it in Switzerland as a bourbon. So that's our American spirit. Why is most of it made in Kentucky? I'll get into that in a little bit, but historically, Kentucky was part of Virginia back in the colonial days, and around the time of the American Revolution and just afterwards, a lot of settlers from Virginia moved across the Blue Ridge and the Appalachian Mountains into the frontier of Virginia, which was the western counties that became the 15th state of Kentucky, but originally that was Virginia, and these settlers were moving over, and a lot of these were, whiskey men that some of them were of Scotch descent or Irish descent, and knew how to make whiskey. They were making a lot of rye back in the olden days. George Washington made rye, but you get over here to Kentucky, and the number one crop is corn. Okay, so they start making bourbon, and those whiskey men, still there. That's still where the best whiskey men live in Kentucky. If you're going to build cars, you go to Detroit. If you're going to build ships, you go to Newport News, Virginia. If you're going to make whiskey or make bourbon, you stay in Kentucky because that's where the whiskey men are. We'll also get into the water in a second, okay, because that's the other very key part. Now, what about the mash bill? On the mash bill on bourbon has to be at least 51% corn. Okay, it can be 100% corn, it can be 51% corn, anywhere in between, but you have to have at least 51% corn in the mash bill. There are some 100% corn bourbons out there. I think Hudson Baby Bourbon and Reservoir from Virginia also are 100%. But those are not that common. Most of them are going to have other grains in it. Typically, there's a flavoring grain, and most bourbons are going to have rye as the flavoring grain. There are low rye bourbons, there are medium rye bourbons, there are high rye bourbons, but they're all going to be obviously less than 50% because 51% of it has to be corn to be the bourbon, and then you can put as much rye after that as you want into it. Some whiskeys use wheat as the flavoring grain instead of rye. Those are what we refer to as the wheated bourbons. Okay, and the substitute that wheat gives it a little more of a softer, sort of a gentler flavor, allows some of the sweetness and the fruitiness to come through a little bit better. Whereas the rye bourbons are a little bit more spicy. That comes from that rye and so forth. So it's a different flavor profile. And then of course there's the 4-grain bourbons. You see a number of those are popping up, and that uses both wheat and rye as a flavoring grain. Then the 4th grain in the 4-grain and 3rd grain in most bourbons is going to be malted barley. Okay, now malted barley is used primarily for its enzymatic potential. It breaks down the complex starches into simple sugars, which makes it a lot easier for fermentation to occur. The yeast can turn those simple sugars into alcohol. So that's what that malt is typically for. There's some bourbons that use other malts. I've seen malted rye. I've seen an all malt. Interesting. But for the most part, your standard bourbon is going to be at least 51% corn. Usually rye is the flavoring grain, and then malted barley. And then there's a large growing segment of wheated bourbons that substitute the wheat for the rye as a flavoring grain. It's still going to be 51% corn because it's a bourbon. And then there's a fair number of 4 grains out there as well that use both wheat and rye as a flavoring grain, again, along with at least 51% corn and that malted barley. So what about aging? Okay, now bourbon has to be aged. It's a whiskey, so it's got to be aged in oak. It has to be specifically new charred oak. Okay, it has to go into a new charred oak container by TTB guidelines. Now, TTB is the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. It's federal government, makes the rules as to what is a bourbon, and you have to abide by those rules. Otherwise, you can't label it as a bourbon. And it has to go into a new charred oak container. Now, notice the word container. It does not have to be a barrel. It can be put in a new charred oak bucket, and you'll have bourbon. But nobody's going to do that because the barrel is the time-tested, most efficient way to age whiskey. So people are going to use barrels. But you could put it in a charred oak box, cube, or anything you want. Still can be a bourbon. Okay, but it's pretty much going to be in a barrel because that's the most efficient way. There's also no specification that it has to be American oak, and that's one of the last rules that I've most recently learned. You do see some of these bourbons that are, in French oak, for example, Mizunara oak. Most of those are going to be finished. They're still usually going to be, initially aged in new charred American oak, and then they might be finished in some other type of oak. But it actually isn't required. You could do primary finishing in French oak. That's perfectly acceptable according to the rules. It's not going to be done that often unless it's an experimental bourbon because American oak is cheap. It's right here. You can chop a tree down here in America. These cooperages that are making most of the barrels for the bourbon industry, there's a few distilleries that make their own barrels, but most of them buy them from cooperages. So they're making these, and they're making them, pretty much out of American oak because it's here, available, and cheap. So if you do see something that has a different type of oak, it's generally a finish, but there are a few experimental ones out there that are actually primarily aged. It's not required to be American oak, but it usually will be. How long does it have to be aged? Again, there's no specification in the TTB rules. As soon as that liquor hits that new charred oak container, you got a bourbon. Now, it's not going to taste very good, okay, because there's no aging on it, but there is no requirement as to how long you have to age it. Pretty much you just have White Dog or White Lightning or Moonshine. Shouldn't say it's not going to taste very good because some people do drink White Dog, but it's not going to give you the the flavors and the color that you associate with bourbon. Okay, you need to put some age on it. How long? Again, not required in the rules, but there's a few rules. For example, a straight bourbon has to be at least 2 years. So if you see straight bourbon whiskey, then you know it's at least 2 years. If it is a non-age stated bourbon, that means that it has to be at least 4 years. Because if you're going to age a bourbon under 4 years, you must put somewhere on that bottle how long you've aged it. You aged at least 3 years, or 2 years in oak, or something like that. You have to say a time. If you don't see any age statement anywhere on the bottle, then it has to be at least 4 years. Decades ago, it was standard for whiskeys to say how old they were. You don't see like 12 year or whatever. It's becoming less common now. If you see 12 years, for example, or any age statement on a bottle, that means that the youngest whiskey in that bottle has to be at least that year of aging. So a 12-year bourbon, if it's from one barrel, it's going to be all that age. But if you do some blending, if you see a 12-year bourbon, you might have some 15-year-old bourbons there, so maybe some 17-year-old bourbons in there. But it has, the youngest bourbon has to be at least 12 years if they're going to stick that age on it. But these days, a lot of bourbons, I think most bourbons are non-age stated. So you can search the internet, you can talk to friends, you might have a person at the distillery that leaks it on Reddit or so, but people have ideas what most bourbons are aged, but there isn't an actual age statement. You're kind of assuming it's at least 4 years old, and then and putting together what you've heard from the internet and other people. So that's the word about how long you have to age it. The couple other rules, for example, with bourbon, you cannot add any color or any flavor to bourbon. 100% of the color has to come from the barrel, and about probably roughly 75% of the flavor comes from the barrel. You've got a few other things that add to the flavor. The mash bill is important. The yeast strain, for example, is important in the taste. But about 3/4 of the taste comes from the barrel, and 100% of the color comes from the barrel. You can't add any artificial colors or flavors to bourbon. Now you can finish them, and that might change the flavor. You can take a bourbon, for example, and put it into an old Cabernet Sauvignon barrel, okay, and that's going to change the flavor, but that's a finished product. It has to be a bourbon before it can be finished. If you put it straight into that barrel beforehand, then you can't make it a bourbon. It has to be made a bourbon and then finished. And that barrel, by the way, because it's a new charred oak barrel, okay, it has to be new, so it can only be used one time to make bourbon. You can use that barrel to finish other liquors. You might see a rum that's finished in bourbon barrel. A lot of scotches are finished in used bourbon barrels, but you can never make bourbon again in that barrel. One time, it has to be a new. And the char level varies. Again, usually the distilleries, when they go to the cooperages, they have a specification of what char level, usually from 1 to 4. And what they call the alligator char at the high end, and that all depends upon how long that barrel has been set on fire. You set a fire in the barrel, it burns the barrel, chars those sugars in the oak and so forth, and caramelizes the inside of the barrel. And the longer you keep that barrel on fire, the higher the char level is going to be. Some people talk about a level 5 char, but which is even longer, but it's usually between like 1 and 4. And you're going to get more of the kind of more smokiness and stuff when the higher chars, and anyway, and that's going to change the flavor. So the barrel, of course, the char level, how long you age it, the where you age it, the level of the rick house, so many factors go into it, but that's all coming from the barrel. And then, of course, you've got the mash bill, which does change the flavor, and you've got the yeast strain. And then you've got the water, okay? And this takes us back to why most bourbons, 95% of bourbons still come from Kentucky, okay? Because Kentucky has the best water in the world, at least in the United States, okay? Maybe the world. So, and that's because of the limestone aquifers that are natural throughout Kentucky, and that water seeps down through that limestone that filters it, and then they bring that water up from those aquifers, and that's what they in those natural springs and so forth that they use to put into the bourbon. And that Kentucky water is got a lot of calcium and magnesium, which gives it a very good flavor, and very, very, very low in iron. Iron will ruin the taste of bourbon. So you don't want iron, you want lots of calcium, magnesium, and that you get through those limestone filtering through those Kentucky aquifers, and that's why Kentucky has the best water, and that's why Kentucky makes the best bourbon, okay? So there's a few other rules that that you may not notice. One you'll notice, of course, is the proof of the bottle. You cannot make bourbon lower than 80 proof, so it's going to have to be at least 80 proof in the bottle. Some of the rules for the distillery that you may not see, for example, you cannot bring the whiskey off of the still any higher than 160 proof. You also cannot put it into the barrel at any higher than 125 proof. Okay, so those are rules for the distillery, and which you may not notice when you're drinking it. Couple of other finishing, for example, you can finish bourbons different ways. One of the age-old questions is Jack Daniel's a bourbon? Okay, because it meets a lot of the guidelines of bourbons made in the United States, in Tennessee. It is 51% corn, so it has a bourbon mash bill. Follows all those rules about coming off the still no higher than 160, going into the barrel no higher than 125, can't be bottled less than 80 proof. So it has a lot of those rules that are associated with bourbon, but it has one thing that keeps it from being a bourbon, and that's the Lincoln County process. It's a Tennessee whiskey. So Tennessee whiskeys basically are flavored with sugar maple charcoal before it goes into the barrel. And that's the key, because it's not finishing. If you took bourbon and then you put it through a column of sugar maple charcoal, you could finish it. Then it would be you could say a Tennessee type finished bourbon, okay? But that's not what Jack Daniel's and George Dickel do. For example, in the Tennessee whiskeys, they filter the white dog before it goes into the barrel. So what they've done now is they've flavored the whiskey before it becomes a bourbon, not after. So that's why Jack Daniel's is not a bourbon. It's Tennessee whiskey, but it's still the biggest selling whiskey of any type on planet Earth. So finishing, you can take that bourbon once you've made it into a bourbon, and you can do different things with it. You can put it in barrels, from previously stored wine, different kinds of liquors. I mean, there's all kind of wild stuff out there. You can put staves of bourbon barrels in there. You can put it into another new charred oak barrel, double barrel it. So all that stuff can be done finishing. You just have to state on the bottle what you've done to it, how it's finished and so forth, but it can still be a bourbon. Couple other things, and then we'll kind of bring this video to a close. Terms you might have heard: small batch. Small batch basically mean that they're batching together a limited number of barrels, but that could vary. Some small distilleries may only throw together a couple of barrels, where you might find Jim Beam throwing 200 barrels together and still calling it small batch. But that means limited number of barrels are put together in that batch, and then it's bottled. Single barrel means that it literally comes from one barrel. It is not mixed or blended with any other barrels. And so that's going to tend to have a much more variability. This bottle of single barrel is going to taste a little bit different than this bottle. Small batch is going to be much more consistent because you're blending those barrels together to sort of achieve that profile that you want, whereas the single barrels may vary. I think that's, obviously with some limitation, because the distillery still knows what it wants that whiskey to taste like. And so if this single barrel isn't within this narrow range, they're going to reject it and put it in something else. So I still think your single barrels are going to still be within a certain range to achieve that profile, but they're going to vary. This bottle might be really good. This one may not be so great, but I don't think you're going to have a single barrel that's fantastic and a single barrel that's horrible. They're going to be closer, but the small batches, because they're blended, are going to be much more consistent in flavor. And then barrel proof means just that, basically that you have not cut that whiskey down. It comes straight out of the barrel and it goes right into the bottle, so it's not going to be cut with any extra water, and it's going to be higher proof. A lot of the barrel proofs will come in, into the 130s, 140s, but most of them probably down in the 120s, 110s, and you even see some barrel proofs that end up still being under 100, just by the way they came. Let's see, bottled in bond. Okay, so bottled in bond, it means that was America's first Consumer Protection Act, and in 1897, I hope I'm not wrong on that, I believe I'm right, but anyway, definitely the late part of the 1800s, and that was because there were people who were rectifiers who were putting some bad stuff in bourbons, and so the federal government said, hey, let's create this Bottled in Bond Act. And that means that you're guaranteeing you're going to get a pure product that's not adulterated. A couple of rules. It has to come from one distillery in one distillation season, so it can't be sourced and blended from other places. It has to come from that distillery from that season, and it has to be aged for at least 4 years. So you can have some bottled in bonds, maybe 10, 15 years, but they have to be at least 4 years. And it has to be aged in a federally bonded warehouse, so the federal government can keep tabs that you're not messing with it. And then it has to be bottled at 100 proof. So that's a bottled in bond. There's some other rules about bourbons. That was one of them. Well, anyway, so if I think of another rule, I'll put it in another video, but those are the most common ones that you'll see, and things that'll be on the bottle. So anyway, that's kind of a bourbon tutorial, get you sort of started on what bourbon is, and come see our reviews on bourbonrocks.com. Thank you.